There's a question nobody in British law enforcement wanted to answer publicly. How do you lose £200 million worth of diamonds, cash, and jewelry from a vault that was supposedly impenetrable and only find out 3 days later? Not 3 hours, 3 days. That gap alone tells you something. Not about the criminals, about the institution that failed to notice they were being robbed. Easter weekend, 2015. London's Hatton Garden District, the heart of the British jewelry trade for over a century. Tucked inside a nondescript building on Hatton Garden Street itself sits the Safe Deposit Center, a facility that held the most precious private assets of hundreds of clients. Gemstone dealers, jewelers, private collectors, people who trusted that their wealth was secured behind reinforced concrete and steel, behind a vault door weighing 2 tons, behind one of the most sophisticated alarm systems money could buy.
What they didn't know, couldn't have known, was that a group of men with a combined age of over 400 years had spent months studying that building, learning its rhythms, finding its seams. And the seam they found was not in the vault wall, it was in the people responsible for watching it. Let's start with what the cameras actually caught. Thursday, the 2nd of April, 2015. A lift shaft inside the building. A rope descends. Then a man. Then another. These are not young men. One of them, investigators would later establish, was 76 years old. They abseiled down using equipment you could find in a standard climbing shop. They move slowly, deliberately. When you watch the footage knowing what comes next, the confidence in their movements is almost unsettling. They're not nervous. They've been here before, or somewhere like it. This is not a crew improvising. This is a crew executing.
They get to work on the vault door. It doesn't budge. So they don't force it. They abandon it entirely. And this decision, this pivot, tells you everything about who these men were. Less experienced criminals would have persisted, would have burned time trying to break what couldn't be broken. These men had a contingency. They always had a contingency. The wall. They drill through the wall. Using an industrial Hilti drill, a machine weighing over 50 kilograms, they bore through a reinforced concrete wall 50 centimeters thick over 2 nights. Not 1, 2. Because on the first night, the drill overheats and breaks down. And here's what makes this detail extraordinary. They leave. They pack up, they go home. They come back the next night with a replacement drill, and they finish the job. Calmly. As if they're contractors on a building site who had a minor equipment setback. By the time they're through, the hole in the wall is roughly 50 centimeters in diameter. Large enough for a man to crawl through, provided he's not too large. One member of the crew apparently was too large. That detail would matter later. They enter the vault. They open 73 safe deposit boxes. The total value of what they take is estimated at somewhere between 14 and 200 million pounds. The enormous range itself revealing something about the nature of these boxes, about what people store in them, about how little of that wealth is ever formally declared. They spend the better part of 2 nights inside that vault, undisturbed. Now, here is where you have to stop and ask the obvious question, because the answer is not obvious at all. Where were the alarms? The building had alarms, multiple systems. The Hatton Garden Safe Deposit Center was protected by a monitored intruder detection system operated by a company called Lynx, contracted through Southern Monitoring Services. When the burglars drilled through the wall, sensors triggered. An alert was sent. A call was made, not to the police, but to a duty manager for the building. The duty manager looked at the alert, assessed the situation remotely, and decided it was a false alarm. He did not investigate physically. He did not contact the police. He canceled the alert and went back to whatever he was doing on a Thursday night before Easter. The system registered further alerts. Those were also dismissed. The police were never called. Not on Thursday night, not on Friday, not on Saturday.
The vault was being systematically emptied, and the people responsible for watching it had decided, without checking, that nothing was happening. On the Tuesday after Easter, a vault customer arrived to access her box and found the door to the vault floor open and the chaos inside. 4 days. The criminals had 4 days before anyone even looked. When detectives from the Metropolitan Police's flying squad arrived, what they found was forensically clean, in a way that spoke to serious preparation. No fingerprints on the obvious surfaces. Tools left behind, but deliberately selected tools, the kind that could be purchased cash with no trail. The criminals had worn coveralls, gloves, used knee pads. They had thought about the forensic aftermath of what they were doing even while they were doing it. But they had not thought about everything. The first break came not from the vault, but from the street. CCTV footage. Not from inside the building, from cameras outside it, on Hatton Garden Street and surrounding roads. Investigators began the painstaking process of tracking vehicles in and out of the area across the relevant nights. A white Mercedes Sprinter van appeared on the footage. It appeared multiple times, parked nearby, moving away in the early hours of the morning. Someone had used it. Someone had parked it with enough awareness to avoid the most obvious camera angles, but not enough to avoid all of them. The van was linked to a plant hire company, and that company had records. And those records led, eventually, through a chain of connections that took weeks to establish, to a man named Brian Reeder. Brian Reeder, 76 years old, career criminal. A man whose history with law enforcement stretched back to the 1970s. He had been convicted in connection with the Brinks Mat gold bullion robbery in 1983, one of the most audacious heists in British history at that time. He had been jailed, he had got out, and here, 3 decades later, he was still at it. Which tells you something. About him, yes, but also about what options were realistically available to a man like Brian Reeder in 2015. He was not a man who could reinvent himself. He was not a man with a pension plan or a legitimate career trajectory. He was a man who knew one thing very well, and the thing he knew was this. Investigators identified several other key figures. Terry Perkins, 67 years old, also a career criminal with a significant prior conviction, an armed robbery of a Security Express depot in 1983, for which he served 11 years. John Kenny Collins, 75. Danny Jones, 60. Carl Wood and William Lincoln rounding out the core group, along with a few peripheral figures who would be identified later. The average age of this crew was 59. The media, when the story broke, couldn't get enough of this detail. The Diamond Weezers, some outlets called them. The Bad Grandpas. It was good copy, and it obscured something important. These were not endearing pensioners who fell into crime by accident. These were men who had spent decades operating at the top of their profession, and their profession happened to be serious organized crime. The age wasn't a joke. The age was evidence of longevity, of the ability to stay operational in an extremely high-risk business across multiple decades. That is not incompetence. That is the opposite. The investigation began to close in, and the method it used was one the criminals had not fully anticipated. They were followed. Physical surveillance, the kind that takes immense patience, resource, and coordination. Flying squad detectives tracked the suspects' movements, monitored their communications, and gathered intelligence the slow way, by watching and waiting. And what they watched led them to a storage unit in Enfield. Inside that unit, recovered from behind a concealed panel, was a significant portion of the stolen goods. Not all of it, far from all of it, but enough. Along with it, investigators found equipment used in the robbery, and something else. A bag. A bag that belonged to one of the suspects. Inside the bag, a receipt. And on that receipt, a name. Small details, ending large cases. It never stops being remarkable. The arrests came in waves. Brian Reeder was taken first, in May 2015. The others followed. Carl Wood was arrested in a church car park. Terry Perkins was apprehended at home. Danny Jones, who would later become something of a central character in the legal proceedings, was picked up in possession of stolen jewelry he had apparently been attempting to move. At trial, several of the men pleaded guilty. Jones, fascinatingly, did not, initially. He ran a defense that hinged on arguing he had been coerced and did not know the full nature of what he was participating in. The jury did not believe him. He was convicted. And the judge, sentencing the various defendants, was notably unimpressed by the cultural fascination with their age. The sentences were substantial. Reeder, due to serious illness and the fact that he pleaded early, received a comparatively reduced term. Perkins, Jones, and Collins received sentences of 6 or 7 years. The others received varying terms. The money, or rather most of it, was never recovered. And this is where the story becomes something else entirely. Investigators believe that only a fraction of the total haul was ever accounted for. The nature of what was stored in those boxes made exact accounting impossible. Private wealth stored in private boxes is, by definition, not on any public record. Some box holders, for reasons you might choose to imagine, did not come forward to declare their losses. The full value of what was taken may never be known, because some of what was taken was never formally declared to exist. That irony is worth sitting with. The very privacy that made the safe deposit center attractive to its clients, the discretion, the anonymity, the off-the-books nature of physical wealth storage, is precisely what made the full accounting of the robbery impossible. The people robbed were, in some cases, unwilling to be fully open about what had been robbed from them. There is a layer beneath the robbery itself that the trial, the convictions, the headlines, none of it quite reached. And it is this. The security failure was not a technical one. The Lynx alarm system worked. It detected the intrusion. It sent the alerts it was designed to send. The failure was human, bureaucratic, institutional. A duty manager making a snap judgment on a bank holiday weekend. A chain of responsibility in which each link assumed the next link was handling it. The kind of failure mode that no amount of steel reinforcement or biometric security can protect against, because it lives entirely in the space between protocols and the people expected to follow them. This is a pattern. It is not unique to Hatton Garden. It is how secure systems fail. Not from the outside in, but from the inside out. The attackers don't beat the system defeats itself, and the attackers walk through the gap. Brian Reeder, who was too ill to stand in the dock during much of the trial, whose health declined sharply after his arrest, who had been convicted of a major heist more than 30 years earlier, and had spent his later life apparently never quite leaving that world. There is something in his trajectory that resists easy categorization. He was not sympathetic in any conventional sense. He and his associates had stolen from people who had trusted a secure facility with things they valued most. But he was also a relic, a man formed by a particular criminal culture of a particular era, operating according to its codes and its logic long past the point where that world had any future. Terry Perkins died in prison in 2021, having served a significant portion of his sentence. The others have since been released or are nearing the end of their terms. The Hatton Garden Safe Deposit Center, in the building where all of this happened, permanently closed. And somewhere out there, in private hands, broken up and moved, converted and dispersed, is the majority of what was taken. The diamonds, the gold, the jewelry, the cash, the contents of 73 boxes that represented the quietly accumulated wealth of hundreds of people, some of whom preferred not to be too specific about what they had lost. There was a moment during the investigation when detectives listened to a conversation, captured on surveillance, between some of the suspects. They were discussing what they had done and what it had been worth, and one of them, satisfied, described it in terms that investigators found almost philosophically blunt. He said they had simply found where the money was and gone and got it. That simplicity is either deeply stupid or deeply honest, depending on how you choose to look at it. These men had studied a system, found its weakness, exploited it, and walked away with most of the proceeds intact. From a purely operational standpoint, measured only against its own objectives, the Hatton Garden job was almost entirely successful. The convictions came later, and for reasons that had less to do with brilliant detective work than with the kinds of small errors, a CCTV van, a bag, a receipt, that accumulate when you are not as careful as you thought you were. But the wealth? Largely gone. The institution? Closed. The question of how so much private wealth came to be stored in anonymous boxes in a Hatton Garden basement, and what that says about who holds wealth and how, and why some of those people preferred permanent loss to public disclosure, that question was never really part of the trial. Maybe it should have been. Here is what stays with me about this case. Beneath all the drama of the drilling and the CCTV and the pensioner criminals and the Easter weekend silence, the vault was not the most secure place in this story. The most secure place was the silence of certain box holders, who, even after being robbed, chose not to say what had been taken from them. That silence protected them more effectively than 2 tons of steel ever had.